Tonight, while abortion trigger bans go into effect in 2 states,
the United States therefore seeks a declaratory judgment.
How a DOJ lawsuit is stopping another. And a nation known for terror ties teams up with another.
Al-Qaeda and Iran have common enemies.
What it means for America. Plus, how another great awakening could bring the healing our hurting country needs. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Trigger laws taking effect in some of the states most eager to ban abortion. Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. In Washington, I'm Matt Gelka. Texas and a few other Republican-led states will ban almost all abortions this week. They are the latest in a group of laws limiting the procedure taking effect following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. So far, 13 states have passed so-called trigger laws that were designed to outlaw most abortions if the High Court threw out the constitutional right to end a pregnancy. CBN's Tara Mergener joins us now with tonight's top story. Tara.
Matt, trigger laws are written to go into effect after an event occurs. In this case, the High Court's ruling on Roe v. Wade. Texas, Tennessee, and Idaho were required to wait 30 days after the formal judgment was issued. That waiting period is now up. Most abortions are illegal in Texas, except to save the life of the mother, with no exceptions in cases of rape or incest. The response from opponents of the new law, swift.
And defend each other's rights and liberties.
Flanked by abortion activists after the law took effect, Democrat Beto O'Rourke attacked Republican rival Governor Greg Abbott, who signed off on the statute.
We understand the cost and the consequence of Greg Abbott being in office.
In Tennessee, abortion is now illegal at fertilization, except to prevent death or serious injury of the mother. The law does not criminalize women seeking an abortion. Tennessee and Texas are among more than a dozen states that have passed trigger laws.
We will closely scrutinize state abortion laws to ensure that they comply with federal law.
Idaho's new law that would have made all abortions felonies was supposed to take effect too.
The United States, therefore, seeks a declaratory judgment that Idaho's law violates the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution.
A federal judge issued a preliminary order Wednesday that the state's abortion ban violated federal law. But changes may not be dramatic. Many of these states already had laws in place that largely blocked women from access to the procedure, with many clinics no longer offering it or moving to states where it remains legal. Matt?
Tara, thank you. For more on this, we want to bring in Dr. Ingrid Scott. She's a practicing OB/GYN who also serves as the Director of Medical Affairs at the Charlotte Lozier Institute. And Dr. Scott, we know you're fresh off a 24-hour shift yourself, so we really appreciate you making the time for us. I want to start with Texas, where you are. And I know you've been outspoken about what you call misinformation about some of Texas's pro-life laws. So what is out there that you think needs to be cleared up?
Well, it's interesting because Texas, of course, was the first state to be able to enforce a law. We had a Heartbeat Act that went into effect almost a year ago. And in terms of intervening to save the life of a woman, doctors have been doing the same thing that they've been doing all along, because nobody considers that an abortion in order to protect the life of the woman. The vast majority of the time, it happens in the second half of pregnancy. And in that situation, I can induce her or I can deliver her by C-section. I don't have to intentionally destroy the baby, which, of course, is what an abortion is. But in Texas, all of a sudden, doctors were confused starting after the Dobbs decision. So what I think has happened is that the doctors aren't reading the law. They're reading the newspaper, and the newspaper's telling them it doesn't know what they can how they can practice. And so consequently, there's a lot of confusion on the ground.
Well, you mentioned doctors, so we'll switch to Tennessee and their trigger law going into effect today. You have some doctors out there who are critical of the affirmative defense clause in that law, basically having to prove that the abortion was performed to protect a mother in order to get felony charges dropped. You're a doctor. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't don't think it needs to go that direction. I don't think we need to have poor doctors using their best medical judgment, but having no one supporting them or having their back and having them live in fear of a lawsuit. What needs to happen in all of the states that are putting these laws into effect is that the state medical board of examiners needs to provide guidance for physicians. In a hospital system, the hospital system needs to provide guidance for physicians. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has many very thorough guidelines for how doctors should intervene in certain situations. So we know what the right thing to do is. We know the situations that are likely to threaten a mother's life. And doctors just need to know that they have the support of their medical organizations and their hospitals to enable them to take the correct actions to protect women.
You know, and finally, in that same vein, we'll go to Idaho, where that law was partially blocked and narrowly blocked, mostly because there was some confusion over providing a medically necessary abortion. Quickly, your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, unfortunately, as might be expected, because all of this is so new, some of the states have laws that are written a little more clearly than others. But at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, an attorney and I have reviewed all of the state's laws, and it is our opinion, based on the way they are written, that every single state's law will allow a physician to intervene in a pregnancy that poses a risk to a woman's life. So I think it's overblown. I think the wording perhaps is a little confusing, but I think it can be fixed, and I think Idaho can protect unborn life just like Texas and Tennessee and many other states are going to do.
Well, Dr. Scott, we really appreciate your insights. And again, fresh off the 24-hour shift, go get some rest.
Thank you.
Thank you. To the president's plan to cancel at least $10,000 in student loans for millions of Americans. The Biden administration maintains it will be entirely paid for, but they don't know how much it's going to cost.
We have to get a better sense, right, of what we're talking about as far as cost. But we do believe it will be fully paid for because of the work that this president has done with the economy. In fact, Goldman Sachs and others estimate that it will reduce inflation. So that's just one more thing that I wanted to add.
The Secretary of Education claims they found legal authority to pass the plan based on provisions found in the HEROES Act. Some on the right have claimed it's just a costly handout, while those who support the plan say it's a major step in the right direction. But outside the White House today, a group rallied to demand the Biden administration forgive all student debt. Critics of the current plan say they worry it will cost taxpayers thousands of dollars while adding pressure to the current rate of inflation. And some good news on the job front. New jobless claims are down. According to new figures from the Labor Department, 243,000 Americans applied for new unemployment claims last week. That's down 2,000 from the week prior. Overall, about 1.4 million people are receiving jobless benefits across the country, with the unemployment rate at around a 50-year low. So for more on those numbers, let's bring in Mark Hamrick, Senior Economic Analyst and Washington Bureau Chief at Bankrate. Mark, all of those numbers sounded pretty good, at least for the labor market. It continues to be pretty strong, 2,000 fewer jobless claims week over week. What do the numbers say to you?
No, the job market is probably the best performing aspect of the economy, and this has been something of a head scratcher in many ways, given the uneven performance of the economy. And, we had a revision in second quarter GDP this morning. It was still a contraction, but not as much as was estimated before. And the question about what is a good job market may really be something that differs from person to person. The reason being that a low unemployment rate for job seekers is a wonderful thing. For consumers, for business operators, for central bankers, not so much, because we know that as of last check, there were 10.7 million job openings in this country. And that means when you compare that against the number of officially unemployed, we have about 1.9 job openings for every single person who is unemployed. And that's how you get to this notion of a tight job market, which that ends up showing its face in locations all throughout the economy where it doesn't seem like there's enough people around to help.
Along with those jobs numbers, we also got revised second quarter GDP numbers out today. Maybe some better news than expected there. It was pretty doom and gloom earlier in the summer.
Well, I don't know that the GDP numbers have actually been doom and gloom. They've really been a function of, first of all, the sort of complicated calculation of that particular figure. And I don't want to, make people's eyes gloss over, but the reality is that the economy has been performing better than those GDP numbers indicate. And that can be seen in something that's generated at the very same time that's called gross domestic income, or GDI. Those numbers have been in positive territory, and economists tend to believe that we should basically average those out. And that indicates that the economy was continuing to expand then. Bottom line, the economy is believed to be expanding in the current quarter, but we just conducted a survey of bank rate that we published this week. That indicates that 7 out of 10 Americans believe that they are quite worried about the prospect for a recession, and 3 out of 4 are taking actions based on that fear. And the number one thing they're doing is cutting back on discretionary purchases. Matt, the impact of that could be that they're actually, in a way, serving to weaken the economy while they focus on necessities, because they're shifting their purchases over to the things they need rather than the things that they may want.
Well, finally, and you brought it up, the recession word, the 2 straight quarters of a shrinking GDP, typically a hallmark of a recession. But I mean, how do you feel? Is it feeling very recession-y out there to you?
Well, it's not so much about what I feel as what everybody else feels. And most Americans do feel as if something is off. And what has been off is the highest inflation in generations. And that's why the Federal Reserve is very focused now on continuing to raise interest rates. We believe they will raise rates again here in the month of September, because they have essentially 2 jobs. One is to seek maximum employment. They've essentially checked that box off at that 3.5% unemployment rate. But stable prices is the other part of that mandate. And we're anywhere where we're as far away from that as we've seen in our lifetimes here, with the consumer price index running at an annual rate increase of 8.5%. The Fed's target for inflation, 2%. So that's a 6.5% difference. You can see why Americans are very distraught about the current state of affairs with inflation. And, whether it's a recession or high inflation, at the end of the day, those things separate them from the ability to pay for the things they want and need. They have the same impact in that regard.
Bank Rate's Mark Hamrick, thank you so much, as always, for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. Well, coming up, Iran's growing terror network and what it means for Israel and the U.S. Next on Faith Nation. Welcome back. From Hezbollah to Hamas, Iran has a vast terror network across the Middle East, greatly driven by hatred of the United States and Israel. And as national security correspondent Caitlin Burke reports, the regime could be expanding its reach.
The U.S. drone strike that eliminated al-Qaeda's Ayman al-Zawahiri could also have put into motion an even more dangerous phase in the global war on terror, one with Iran at the helm.
One might not expect that the world's leading state-sponsored terrorism that's a Shia revolutionary regime would partner with a Sunni terrorist group. These are oil and water, you might think. But in actuality, there is a very close relationship between these two.
Iran's connection to al-Qaeda dates back to the early 1990s, when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard helped Osama bin Laden run jihadist training camps in Sudan. The regime also offered safe haven to al-Qaeda leadership fleeing Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. Saif al-Adil, a face on the FBI's first list of most wanted terrorists, was among those protected.
Saif al-Adil is next in line to be leader of al-Qaeda. He's the crown prince of al-Qaeda, if you will. Now, there's no guarantee that al-Qaeda leadership is actually going to tap him, but that's the smart bet. And Saif al-Adil has been living the al-Qaeda life in Iran for many years.
There's concern Iran will now seek to take advantage of that relationship, bringing al-Qaeda into the fold as another proxy to do the regime's dirty work.
Al-Qaeda and Iran have common enemies. They both hate the United States. They both hate Israel. They both hate Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni Gulf monarchies. If al-Qaeda is mounting terrorist attacks against all or any of those organizations, that advances Iran's strategic objectives, and it does so in a way that's deniable.
Nathan Sales, former ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism under the Trump administration, says the wild card in how this will all play out is Afghanistan.
Now that the Taliban is back in business of providing safe haven to senior al-Qaeda figures, as we saw with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was living in the heart of downtown Kabul, presumably under Taliban protection, does that mean that other al-Qaeda leaders likewise are going to relocate themselves and their families into the safe haven of Afghanistan under Taliban control?
If that happens, Sales tells CBN News it could change the relationship between al-Qaeda and Iran. Other experts warn it could also result in a sort of three-way unholy alliance.
They're not identical ideologically. They come from very distinct backgrounds, but they're willing to put their differences aside when it comes to their hatred towards the West broadly and America specifically.
Gabriel Nerona, former Iran advisor for the State Department, says no matter how this plays out, the U.S. needs a proactive approach.
I think we have to really up our counterterrorism strike capability. We need to work with local partners, have intelligence on the ground so we can identify these threats and take them out early. And then I think the big thing is money. Money is the sinews of war. If you don't have money, you can't do a whole lot. I think we need to get a lot more serious about our sanctions.
Since President Biden took office, there's been a clear pivot away from counterterrorism efforts towards the threat posed by China. While both Nerona and Ambassador Sales agree that's important, they warn we can't afford to be complacent in the Middle East. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Is America at a crisis point? Meet a man who says, without revival, we will die. After this. Three months after the horrific school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, the school district there has fired Police Chief Pete Arredondo. He is the first officer to lose his job following the shooting that took the lives of 19 children and 2 teachers. Nearly 400 members of law enforcement rushed to the school that day, but waited 70 critical minutes to engage the gunman. Arredondo, who was in charge of the police response, has faced intense criticism for not ordering them to act sooner. From mass shootings and increasing violence to political, racial, and social unrest, it feels like America is reeling. So what will heal the deep divisions in our country? Many Christians believe the answer lies in a new great awakening. Charlene Aaron brings us that story.
From the nation's capital to the harvest fields of the Midwest, believers have been crying out to God for spiritual renewal in America. Some believe the nation sits on the brink of collapse, with the only hope being a visitation of God's power and presence.
Revival or we die. That's where you have to get. You have to get to that place where you can't live any longer without visitation. It could be personal. It could be personal revival where you know there must be a breakthrough.
What will heal the deep racial, social, and political divisions that are tearing us apart? In his new book, Revival or We Die, A Great Awakening is Our Only Hope, Dr. Michael Brown says revival is vital to seeing things change.
We're at that critical moment again. America's being torn apart by the seams, and we've seen there are no political solutions, there are no social solutions, and the church itself has become impotent. So we're at a crisis point in American history where without divine visitation, America as we know it could come to an end or could be so marred that the world our kids or grandkids grow up in will be very, very different.
Dr. Corney Becker, Dean of Regent University's School of Divinity, agrees, saying we've reached a time of spiritual reckoning.
But I believe America recognizes that politics cannot save her. Ideology cannot save her. Social change cannot save her. Only the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ.
A student of past revival movements, Becker believes in order to experience true spiritual renewal, the church must first prepare.
Revival throughout the history of the church is always a sovereign move of God. No man can, in essence, make it happen. It is supernatural. And so what we desperately need to do is to cry out to God. And that's what Psalms 85 says. Revive us, O Lord. And then secondly, to search our hearts, to allow the Holy Spirit to search our hearts.
In 1995, Brown helped lead the Brownsville Revival in Florida, which lasted 6 years. He says supernatural moves of God are unscripted and out of the norm.
When revival happens, it's not just a matter of one or two people getting excited or a crowd getting lifted up. Revival happens outside of church buildings. Some of the greatest testimonies we heard during the days of the Brownsville revival were after people left, or when they got to their church service next Sunday, the fire of God would fall, and the fire of God would continue to burn for months and even for years.
Becker is hopeful that the nation is on the verge of something even bigger.
True revival happens in the streets, happens in the homes, and happens in the darkest places of society. Think of the most chaotic places in our world, the darkest places in our world. That's where the Spirit is hovering, waiting to recreate. It's not too late for America.
An impact he believes will be undeniable.
We will see monumental change, firstly in the church, but we will also see it within community. We will see families being restored. We will see crime go down. We will see a thirst and hunger for holiness within our world.
Signs Brown says are already taking place.
As I've been out ministering, just this year, as restrictions have lifted after COVID, I'm seeing God move in ways. I'm seeing hunger. I'm seeing people weeping in the presence of God. I'm seeing people set free and transformed. It's happening here and there. I believe it's going to be nationwide, and we could literally see the nation ablaze with revival fire.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Well, coming up, a teen follows his dreams around the world and into the record books. His story next. Well, finally tonight, while most 17-year-olds are starting their senior year of high school, one British teen landed himself in the Guinness Book of World Records, literally. When his final flight hit the ground, Mac Rutherford became the youngest person to fly around the world solo. Along with becoming the youngest person to circle the globe flying alone, the 17-year-old is also the youngest to do so in a micro-light plane. Rutherford followed in the footsteps of his sister, so that's a very flight fancy family. Her name was Zara, and becoming the youngest woman to fly solo around the world earlier this year. And here I am getting stressed out at the airport. That's going to do it for us. We'll see you tomorrow.